Everyone knows the gunslinger, almost nobody knows the man. The name Doc Holliday conjures images of smoke-filled saloons, the cold gleam of a pistol, and the legendary gunfight at the OK Corral. He's the killer who stood beside Wyatt Earp, a phantom of the Old West. But the real story of John Henry Holliday doesn't start with a gun. It starts with a silver spoon. Born in 1851 into the heart of Georgia's southern aristocracy, young John Henry had it all. His family was wealthy, respected, and part of the plantation-owning elite. He wasn't raised in a dusty saloon. He was raised in a world of privilege, with private tutors, strict etiquette lessons, and a classical education. He was brilliant. By his teenage years, he was fluent in Latin, Greek, and French. He could play the piano beautifully and was well-versed in philosophy. This wasn't the background of a future outlaw. It was the making of a Southern gentleman, a scholar, a professional. He followed this path with remarkable success. At just 20 years old, he graduated from the Pennsylvania College of Dental Surgery, one of the finest dental schools in the country. He returned to Georgia, a dapper young doctor with a promising career ahead of him. Dr. Holliday was intelligent, refined, and highly skilled. Patients respected him, his family adored him, and his future seemed limitless. He was the golden boy of Griffin, Georgia. And then, everything changed. At age 22, he began to suffer from a persistent, racking cough. The diagnosis was swift and brutal: consumption. Today, we call it tuberculosis. In the 1870s, it was a death sentence. There was no cure, no effective treatment. The doctors gave him a few months to live, maybe a year if he was lucky. The disease that had claimed his own mother when he was just a boy had now come for him. Imagine being 22 years old, at the peak of your life, and being told it's all over. Your body will slowly, painfully, waste away. You will suffocate. His family and friends urged him to rest, to stay home, to conserve what little energy he had left. But Doc Holliday refused to go quietly. If he was going to die, he would die on his own terms. He chose the one place that offered a sliver of hope, a place as wild and unforgiving as the disease consuming him, the American West. Doctors believed the dry, arid climate of the West might slow the progression of tuberculosis. It could buy him time. For Doc, it was more than that. It was a chance to escape the pitying looks, the whispers, and the suffocating gentility of the South. The West was a place where a man was judged not by his pedigree or his health, but by his grit. So, he packed his bags, leaving behind everything he had ever known, and headed towards the frontier, a dying man in search of a place to live. His first stop was Dallas, Texas. He tried to set up a dental practice, but his illness was a constant, humiliating companion. In the middle of working on a patient, he would be seized by a violent coughing fit, sometimes spitting up blood. People were terrified of catching the disease. Patients fled, business dried up. The refined Southern doctor was now an outcast, shunned and feared. This is where the transformation truly began. The humiliation and isolation fueled a cold fury inside him. To make money, he turned to the one skill every Southern gentleman was taught: cards. He became a gambler, frequenting the saloons he once would have disdained. And in these rough-and-tumble establishments, his cough wasn't just a medical problem. It was a sign of weakness. Drunks would mock him, rivals would use it to try and throw him off his game. One night, a man made a joke about his coughing. Instead of shrinking away, Doc fixed the man with an icy glare. His hand, steady despite his illness, rested near his pistol. The saloon went silent. In that moment, the dentist from Georgia died, and the gunslinger was born. He learned that in the West, a reputation for violence was a form of self-preservation. If people feared you, they left you alone. His reputation grew as he drifted from one frontier town to another: Fort Griffin, Denver, Dodge City. He wasn't known as the fastest draw. There were plenty of men who could pull a gun quicker. Doc's deadliness came from something else entirely: his complete and utter fearlessness. When you already have a death sentence hanging over your head, what's one more man with a gun? Doc didn't care if he lived or died, and that made him terrifying. He would stand his ground when others would back down. His calm, almost detached willingness to kill combined with his sharp intellect, made him one of the most dangerous men on the frontier. It was in Dodge City, the rowdy heart of the cattle trails, that he met the man who would define his life, Wyatt Earp. Earp was a lawman, a gambler, a man with his own complicated past. He was tough, imposing, and respected. But unlike everyone else, when Wyatt looked at Doc, he didn't see a dying consumptive. He saw a man of intelligence, unwavering loyalty, and a spine made of steel. And Doc, in turn, saw something equally rare in Wyatt. A man who didn't pity him. He saw a friend. Their bond was forged in the fires of the frontier. They were two outsiders, both misunderstood, both living by their own code. Earp was the stoic lawman, and Doc was his volatile shadow. They gambled together, drank together, and backed each other up without question. If you picked a fight with one, you had a fight with both. Their friendship became one of the most legendary and fiercely loyal in the history of the Old West. Earp trusted Doc's intellect and his nerve, and Doc gave Earp the one thing he could always count on: absolute allegiance. But even as this powerful friendship blossomed, Doc's demons were closing in. The drinking, meant to numb the constant pain in his lungs, grew heavier. The coughing fits became more violent, leaving him gasping for air. His temper, always short, became explosive. He was a man running out of time, and the pain and fear manifested as a hair-trigger rage. He got into duel after duel, over cards, over perceived insults, over nothing at all. He was a magnet for trouble, a walking embodiment of chaos. He was fighting a war on two fronts: against the disease devouring him from the inside, and against the violent world he had chosen on the outside. His body was failing, his reputation was preceding him, and his friendship with Wyatt Earp was about to pull him into the most famous gunfight in American history. All roads, for both men, were now leading to a dusty, silver-rich boomtown in the Arizona desert, a place that would become synonymous with their names forever. When Doc Holliday rode into Tombstone, he was a ghost of a man. A brilliant dentist from Georgia, now a skeletal figure consumed by tuberculosis. He coughed blood into his handkerchief every single day. But despite his failing body, his loyalty to his friend, Wyatt Earp, was unbreakable. And in Tombstone, Arizona, that loyalty would be tested by fire and blood. In 1880, Tombstone was the heart of a silver boom. It was a town of dreams and greed, where saloons overflowed with miners, gamblers, and prospectors. But beneath the glitter of silver, a dark current of corruption and violence was pulling the town under. The real power didn't belong to the law. It belonged to a ruthless gang of outlaws known as the Cowboys. Led by figures like Ike and Billy Clanton and Frank and Tom McClory, the Cowboys ran a sprawling criminal empire. Their business was cattle rustling, robbery, and intimidation. They saw Tombstone not as a community, but as their personal treasure chest, and they weren't about to let anyone get in their way. Especially not the Earp brothers, Virgil, Morgan, and Wyatt, who had come to town to enforce the law and make their own fortunes. Wyatt Earp was a formidable man, a lawman, with a reputation for being unbending and fearless. He saw the Cowboys for what they were: a cancer on the town. As Virgil became the town marshal and Wyatt a deputy, the conflict was inevitable. The Earps started pushing back against the Cowboys' influence, and the Cowboys responded with threats. They weren't just targeting the law, they were targeting the Earps personally, and when you threatened Wyatt Earp, you were also threatening Doc Holliday. Doc didn't have a badge, but he had Wyatt's back, and that was all that mattered. The tension simmered for months, a low boil that everyone knew was about to explode. On the morning of October 26, 1881, it finally did. The Cowboys, armed and openly defiant, had gathered near a livery stable and horse corral known as the OK Corral. After a series of heated confrontations throughout the town, Virgil Earp made the decision to disarm them, a legal move that was destined to turn violent. Wyatt and Morgan Earp walked with Virgil, and beside them, walking into history, was Doc Holliday. He wasn't a lawman, but he was family. Under his long gray coat, he hid a double-barreled shotgun, a brutal weapon for what was about to happen. They met the Cowboys, Ike and Billy Clanton, Frank and Tom McClory, and Billy Claiborne, in a narrow, vacant lot. Words were exchanged, harsh and final. Then the world erupted. The gunfight at the OK Corral lasted no more than 30 seconds. 30 seconds of deafening gunfire, swirling gun smoke, and pure chaos. Doc Holliday leveled his shotgun and fired, the blast tearing into Tom McClory at point-blank range. Pistols cracked, bullets whizzed through the air. When the dust finally began to settle, 3 cowboys lay dead or dying in the street. Billy Clanton and both McClory brothers were gone. Hollywood would later turn those 30 seconds into a glorious legend of good versus evil, a defining moment of the heroic Old West. But for Doc Holliday, it wasn't a victory. It was the beginning of the end. That gunfight didn't make him a hero. It ruined what was left of his life. The aftermath was a nightmare. The remaining cowboys and their allies cried murder. Wyatt and Doc were arrested and charged. Though they were eventually cleared in court, the verdict of the law meant nothing on the frontier. The cowboys wanted revenge, a blood feud that would follow the Earps and Holliday to the ends of the earth. Tombstone, once a place of opportunity, became a trap. Every shadow held a potential assassin. Every corner could hide a rifleman. The threats escalated until they became a horrifying reality. One night, as Morgan Earp was playing a game of billiards, a shot rang out from a dark alley. The bullet tore through a window and struck Morgan in the back, killing him almost instantly. Wyatt Earp, who cradled his dying brother, was changed forever. The lawman was gone. In his place was an avenger. And so began the Earp Vendetta Ride, one of the most ruthless and relentless manhunts in the history of the American West. Wyatt, deputized by a U.S. Marshal, formed a federal posse to hunt down every man involved in Morgan's murder. And right by his side, coughing and bleeding but unwavering, was Doc Holliday. For weeks, they rode across the Arizona Territory, hunting their enemies with cold, calculated precision. This wasn't about arrests or trials anymore. It was about vengeance. Doc Holliday, the dying dentist, became a key instrument of that vengeance. He was no longer just a gambler defending his friend. He was a killer. He killed more men on that ride than at any other time in his life, his gun speaking for Wyatt's grief and rage. He was a walking contradiction, a man of education and refinement, now living the life of a wanted outlaw. He fought in brutal shootouts, all while his own body was waging a losing war against tuberculosis. He was coughing blood between gunfights, drinking heavily to numb the pain and the fear, burning through the last embers of his strength. The ride took a terrible toll. By 1882, the disease had ravaged him so completely that he could barely stay in the saddle. Wyatt Earp eventually had to make an impossible choice. He left Doc behind in Colorado. It wasn't a betrayal, it was an act of mercy. He knew his friend was dying, and the brutal life of a fugitive was only hastening the inevitable. Doc was too weak to continue the fight. Their legendary partnership had come to an end. Doc Holliday drifted to Glenwood Springs, Colorado, a town famous for its therapeutic hot springs. He hoped the sulfurous vapors might offer some relief, some final comfort. He lived in a room at the Hotel Glenwood, overlooking the springs. His days were a blur of sleepless nights, filled with coughing fits, occasional poker games when he felt strong enough, and a constant reliance on whiskey to help him breathe. He was just waiting. On the morning of November 8, 1887, the end finally came. The man who had survived countless gunfights and lived his life on the edge knew his time was up. As he lay in his hotel bed, he asked for a glass of whiskey. Then, looking down at his own feet, which were bare, he started to laugh. All his life, Doc Holliday had firmly believed he would die violently in a gunfight with his boots on. The irony of dying peacefully in a bed was not lost on him. His last words, whispered through a final, faint chuckle, were, "This is funny." He was only 36 years old. The world remembers Doc Holliday as a legendary gunslinger, a cold-blooded killer from the Wild West. But the reality was far more complex and far more tragic. He was a brilliant, educated gentleman, a man of letters and culture whose life was derailed by a devastating illness. His journey into violence was driven by loyalty to a friend, by the harsh realities of the frontier, and by a world that constantly pushed him into corners he never would have chosen for himself. Behind the myth of the gunslinger is the story of a man fighting a desperate losing battle, not just against outlaws, but against his own body. Behind the legend is a tragedy. And behind that tragedy is a man who, until his last breath, was simply trying to stay alive in a world that only ever remembered him for the gun in his hand. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into the forgotten corners of history. We'll see you next time.